Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma.
I'm Billi.
This week, the head of Australia's spy agency, Mike Burgess, gave his annual threat assessment address.
ASIO investigations have identified at least 3 different countries plotting to physically harm people in Australia. In a small number of cases, we held grave fears for the life of the person being targeted. ASIO's intelligence indicated a different hostile foreign intelligence service wanted to harm and possibly kill one or more individuals on Australian soil. Working with our international partners, we determined this plot was part of a broader effort by the regime to eliminate critics of the foreign government around the world. Activists, journalists, ordinary citizens.
So Emma, it is the 6th year that the ASIO boss has delivered a wide-ranging speech like this. But for many reasons, specific details about these threats and where they come from are kept confidential. You and I were talking about this morning, about the reasons why they have to keep the details very confidential. So I think the question that we want to look at today is Australia more or less safe than it was a year ago?
Yeah, so to unpack what Mike Burgess said and the role of ASIO in our everyday lives, I've decided to bring in an expert for this one to help us read between the lines. Sometimes the language of these addresses can be quite complex and feel quite far away. Jennifer Parker is a defence analyst and security expert with ANU's National Security College. She also has extensive operational experience with over 20 years of service with the Royal Australian Navy under her belt. And she joins us now. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Emma, thanks for having me on.
We are really excited to be chatting to you today. We're talking, of course, about this wide-ranging speech from ASIO Director General Mark Burgess this week. What is the significance of the annual threat assessment? What is the purpose of it?
Look, I think the purpose of it is to make sure the Australian public is aware of what has been happening. So often there's a lot of criticism of defence and national security organisations in Australia because we say they lack transparency. Well, actually, when you look at ASIO, which is really one of our most secret organisations in Australia, I think this annual threat assessment is an approach to make sure that the Australian public understands what is happening and can respond to that. And I think that's become even more important given what has been the significant deterioration of our strategic circumstances with conflict in Europe, conflict in the Middle East, and seeing some of that play out actually in Australia with impacts on our social cohesion.
What are some of the major themes that came out of the address this time around? Was there much that had changed or shifted from this year to last year?
Look, I think the first thing that's actually shifted is how ASIO have approached this annual threat assessment. So in previous years, it's kind of been a backcast. So it's been a look at what has happened and what have been some of those trends. Intentionally this year, ASIO have sent to kind of declassify elements, or they've said declassify elements of their forward-looking assessment till 2030. So not only say what's happened, but what do we expect to see in the next 5 years? What are going to be the trends? So I think that's the first change. I think the second change is that Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, was clearly at pains to highlight the fact that we are in a really difficult time for a whole bunch of reasons, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But he called it the most significant and sobering assessment. And that is something that is really something that the public should take on board in terms of the impact of how much things are changing. Now, what are those things that are changing? Look, of course, there is a discussion in it around foreign influence operations within Australia, and that's a discussion we've actually been having probably for about 10 years in Australia. And Australia has taken a lot of proactive measures to put laws in place to try and reduce that. There's been discussion, of course, about the threat of terrorism. What's changed on that point is the fact that Mike Burgess highlights that the way we've traditionally thought about terrorism, the threat of terrorism in the last 20 years, has started to morph. And we're seeing potential terrorists, people being influenced by mixed ideologies, not the traditional things. You know, we've talked a lot in the last 20 years about the influence of Al-Qaeda, certainly in the last 10 years about the influence of ISIS. But actually some of the examples given in this threat assessment talk about people with, extreme leftist views who also support neo-Nazis, which to the average person seems completely at odds. But this is this mixed ideology, which is difficult to track. So the threat assessment talks about that as a change. It also talks about something we talk about a lot these days, which is the influence of social media in allowing that to be propelled and how that's impacting both political violence, anti-Semitism within Australia. So that's a key trend change. The other trend change is I think there's a clear warning in the threat assessment brief about our upcoming election and the potential influence of foreign actors on trying to influence the outcome of that election through ideas of misinformation or disinformation. And that's been a common trend throughout democratic elections now over the last couple of years, something that Australia has been fairly resilient to, but clearly a concern for ASIO this year. I think the other trend is there's a really overt conversation about issues of espionage. Now, when we think espionage, we think James Bond, we think Cold War. But there's a clear trend in the threat assessment saying that espionage, especially as Australia continues to develop some of its high-tech capabilities, so AUKUS, Australia's nuclear-powered submarine pathway is mentioned, espionage is becoming an increasing threat. And we did see last year, in fact, the Korolov case where we had a member of the Australian Defence Force who was actually found to have been spying for Russia. And then the other trend is this idea of sabotage, which is the idea that foreign actors, so foreign governments might seek to actually impact infrastructure in Australia. And that is a trend we're seeing across Europe. So in the last 12 months, there's been about 100 sabotage attacks, from subsea cables to fires in warehouses to cyber attacks that have actually been attributed to Russia. So some clear changes in this threat assessment, not only in the way it's approached, but the issues that we are having to deal with. And these are trends not just impacting Australia, but impacting globally.
So many of the kind of threats and trends that you've articulated there really speak to emerging challenges and technology innovations and, unprecedented conversations around the new face of extremism, mixed ideologies, as you mentioned. How does ASIO kind of work to respond to and manage those threats in that evolving space? And I guess more broadly, for some of our listeners, what does ASIO actually do?
Yeah, look, I think I have never worked in ASIO, but certainly their approach seems to be first to be able to understand what is happening. That involves human intelligence, which actually was mentioned a lot in the threat assessment report. That is people of the general public who may work with ASIO, who might inform ASIO. And in fact, as a slight segue, the report actually talked about the sacrifices that these people make for their country and establishing a plaque to actually honour them in the ASIO building. Of course, there is a huge cyber presence from ASIO. Now, we don't know exactly what that entails, but in the threat assessment, we saw that the ASIO cyber team, for want of a better definition, had actually discovered a plot in the US of a young kid who was planning, sadly, a school shooting in the US, and they had managed to detect that online and stop that. So ASIO manages internal security in Australia. Now, they have 7 key areas of security that they're meant to focus on, and that's issues from terrorism to foreign interference to protection of defence capability. But that is their broad role. Now, of course, being a security intelligence organisation, they don't tell us exactly what they do or exactly their structure, but you kind of get the sense.
I think that some of the kind of terms that we hear in these conversations, foreign spies, intelligence operations, hostile nation states, it does all sound a little bit like a spy movie to a lot of us. Burgess didn't give too much away. He spoke about at least 3 different countries plotting to physically harm Australia. He mentioned another country or regime that had sought to harm individuals who were critical of its government. Why wouldn't ASIO name those countries? What are the pros and cons of disclosing those kinds of details?
Hello, Billi here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
I think that, of course, for any intelligence agency, keeping details up their sleeve is beneficial for their ability to be able to undertake their operations. Of course, there's also that diplomatic element. It's not necessarily always a good thing to publicly embarrass other countries. And we saw an example of this last year, actually, with the significant fallout between India and Canada, when the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, talked about Canada's assessment that India had been sponsoring assassinations within the Sikh community in Canada of Canadian citizens. Now, I don't want to unpack that detail, but that's an example of when these things are exposed publicly, they can result in a significant diplomatic fallout. The other thing too we need to be careful of when we talk about issues of security is making sure that we don't impact social cohesion in Australia. Sometimes calling out certain countries or certain groups can unfortunately result in the persecution of people or groups associated with that. You know, we can think of plenty of examples of that in our history. So there's a bunch of things to balance there. And I think that, ASIO is absolutely right not to be declaring these countries. Although I do know there was a little bit of a warning in the threat assessment to some of these foreign actors that Mike Burgess actually did say that if some of this behaviour continues, they may well release it publicly. Now, I'm paraphrasing dramatically, but it is a tool that they can use. But I think for the moment, I think this is the appropriate approach.
Will there be kind of behind closed doors tense conversations or consequences for some of those unnamed countries? I mean, I know at these times people always speculate about, Russia, China, Iran, etc. Is stuff going on behind closed doors that we're not seeing?
Yeah, look, it certainly sounds like it. So it was also clear from the speech that the countries that have been found out, that it has been made clear to them by Australian intelligence organisations that they have been found out. And in some ways, that's actually a consequence enough for a country, because that's quite embarrassing to know that your spies, for want of a better term, have been located, or your espionage activities, your interference activities have been disclosed, because that shows that you have vulnerabilities in your system. So without that being declared across, 24/7 media, you've actually kind of embarrassed them internally anyway, which may actually deter them from undertaking those actions, because they realise how strong our security apparatus can be.
It strikes me that there's so much in the unsaid in terms of these kinds of conversations and reading between the lines. What would be your advice, as a security expert, for people that don't have that level of expertise, hearing terms like, foreign actors, sabotage, foreign interference? What's your advice about how we should be interpreting this language?
Look, I think the first thing is not to be alarmed. I think that sometimes, especially with, the significant changes even in 2025 on the international stage, whether we're talking about the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, or we're talking about social cohesion in Australia, there can be a tendency to catastrophize everything. That's the first thing not to do, right? I think that a lot of attention needs to be paid to what Mike Burgess is saying in terms of the most significant and sober assessment. I think that Australians need to be real with the fact that the world is dramatically changing, and that may impact our way of life if we don't, build the architecture or the capability to buffer against that. But don't be alarmed. I think the second bit is to be aware. If you are in some of the communities that are experiencing some of this coercion from foreign actors, which is talked about in the threat assessment, then that's something that you should report. And there is a national security hotline that you can call and report that to. And I'm sure, I don't know for certain, but I'm sure some of the reports that ASIO has had and how they know some of this stuff is because of some of that reporting. But I think more broadly, just being more aware of how Australia is being impacted by some of these global changes and what that might mean for our own security.
Do you think Australia is more or less safe than it was a year ago?
What I would say is, when you think about what are Australia's core interests, what are important to Australia, charged question, but, what are Australian values? What are the things we depend on for the way of life that, we should be pretty proud to have? I mean, we are, it's a coin of phrase, which sounds a little bit corny, but it's true. We are a very lucky country, and I think we often forget that. That said, we are not immune to what is happening globally, and we've seen that play out in terms of the conflict in Gaza and how that's played out in Australian communities, whether that be Jewish communities or Palestinian communities. we're not immune to these global trends. And as the world becomes more unstable, which unfortunately is what is happening, there's a lot of evidence to point to that, then we need to be really kind of sure of ourselves as a community, sure of believing a little bit, I guess, in our government, in our security agencies who are trying to protect that way of life that we get to have. Now, all of that sounds a little bit corny, but at the crux of it, it is true. I mean, we are very lucky to live in Australia, and that's something that we need to work hard to protect.
Speaking of, protecting what we have here in Australia, voters are, of course, heading to the polls this year. We know ASIO has raised some flags about election interference. What are the main concerns there, and how can we get around them?
Yeah, look, this was a key theme in the assessment report because a lot of democracies have gone through elections, and obviously 2024 was a huge election year with, elections in India, elections in the US, elections in the UK, you name it. We have seen this trend of other countries, and there are examples, for example, of Russia doing this, of trying to interfere with the outcome. How do they do that? Through misinformation and through disinformation. By, to be quite frank about it, by spreading lies or by twisting truths. And ASIO have really highlighted that that's something that they are going to be watching for this election. In terms of what can the average Australian do, well, part of it is just verifying. I mean, when you receive information, think about what is the source you're receiving that from. If it's someone who you've never heard of on Twitter who seems to have no details and about 2 followers, then it's probably not necessarily reliable, right? If you're still a Twitter person, I know that for a lot of people that's been cancelled. So just think about the source that you're getting it from and try and verify that, especially for something who's going to influence your thinking in the lead up to the election.
Jennifer, before we wrap up, I just want to zoom out a little bit. This is the 6th annual address that we've gotten from ASIO Director Mark Burgess. And, every year there are obviously certain priorities, but also, a lot of information that is kept away from the public and for the reasons that you've explained. But do you think that this information that we do get is effective? Is this an important kind of moment annually for national security?
Look, I do think it's an important moment. I mean, there has been some criticism that if you're not going to tell us all the details, don't tell us anything. But I think if we step back and say, well, what is the point of this, right? The point of this is to have a degree of transparency in our security agencies to make sure we have an informed public that understands what is going on. And the trends are not good. And again, I said don't be alarmist and don't catastrophize, but they're not good. I mean, I go back to those terms I've used before, the most significant and sober assessment that has been delivered, certainly in Mike Burgess's tenure, so the last 6 years. That's something that we should stand up and pay attention to. So I think it is a really important part of our society. And again, going back to that lucky country part, which I'm sure people are rolling their eyes about how corny that sounds, not a lot of countries actually get that degree of transparency. And I think that's a really important part of Australia and an important part of our democracy.
Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Emma.